Hello, and thanks for tuning in to M Compass Media Syria Report Special. I'm your host, Finbar Markey. I'm joined today by Vanessa Beeley, who is a journalist living in Damascus in Syria. Over the last few weeks in particular, Syria has come under constant attack from Israel, which shares a very small border with Syria. At the same time, the northeast of the country sees US military intervention and activity, whilst the US appears to be assisting elements to steal oil and natural resources out of Syria. And in the north, you have Kurdish elements that are financed and backed by the US government that are causing mayhem up there too. And that's not taken into account the terrorist organizations that have been financed by NATO countries over the last few years. That's quite a mouthful in itself. To unpack some of that, I'm joined, as I say, by Vanessa Beeley, who's living in Damascus and who's one of the only people who have gone to Damascus to find out what really is happening in Syria and has been willing to tell that truth around the world. I think, honestly describe her as a thorn in the side of elements like the CIA. Thanks for joining us today, Vanessa.
All right, thanks for having me back on, Finn. It's good to be with you.
Yeah. You're having problems even today. And this is one thing that really irritates me about the lived experience of regular citizens in Syria, that they're denied even electricity for a whole day. For us to organize this interview was in itself problematic for some of the basics, electricity.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, exactly what a lot of people don't understand. I think most people now are aware of the Western-backed regime change war that has been waged against the Syrian people, the Syrian army, their allies, and the presidency since 2011. But many people, I found out recently, are not really aware of the kind of nitty-gritty of the situation on the ground. And they are perhaps aware that the US is occupying the northeast of Syria. Of course, previously through its ISIS proxy that it uses as its pretext to be on the ground militarily in Syria. In reality, of course, ISIS is nothing more than another tool of the US to try and destabilize not only Syria, but Iraq as well. But the oil that is occupied by the US and its various proxies is being stolen on an almost daily basis. More than 80% of Syrian oil is taken out of Syria by the Kurdish Contras under the protection of the US, and this also means air protection, by the way. So full military protection to enable it to be stolen out of Syria and taken to US military bases, very often in Iraq. Some of the oil is actually sent into their Al-Qaeda assets in the north and the northwest, where they have a monopoly over the processing of the stolen oil, which is then traded outside Syria. And so therefore, why are they doing this? It's certainly not necessarily for the revenue, and it's not really for the resources themselves. You know, the US has its own supply. It doesn't need Syrian oil. So why is it doing it? It's doing it to increase the misery of the Syrian people in the hope that the Syrian people will rise up again against their government. What it underestimates, of course, is the intelligence and resilience of the Syrian people, who since 2011 have pretty much known exactly what's going on here and who is responsible for the bloodshed, the economic misery in their country.
And it's not just the United States is the problem there. The United States' key ally in the region, Israel, has just, especially over the last few weeks, and you're experiencing it directly, has been launching missile attacks on Syria on an almost daily basis. Where does Israel fit into this?
Well, of course, one of the main reasons for the start of the regime change war was President Bashar al-Assad's refusal to abandon the Palestinian cause, and the main, let's say, militia who defend the Palestinian cause, which include Hezbollah, and its long-term defense treaty with Iran, And as a result, of course, for the security of Israel, that's one of the reasons that the war against Syria started in 2011. There are a number of other reasons, but that's where Israel comes into it. And since 2011, Israel has not only provided medical treatment for the armed groups, including, of course, Al-Qaeda, but it is also admitted to supplying weapons and equipment, so effectively sponsoring the same terrorist groups that the West are sponsoring in Syria in order to remove the Syrian government and the presidency and to replace it with a Muslim Brotherhood Islamist regime that would be compliant with both US and Zionist agendas in the region and provide Israel with the security that it needs. In reality, of course, what has happened, certainly recently, is an increased unity of the resistance axis. And we've seen a number of events taking place, particularly since February the 6th, when the double earthquake hit Syria, and what was Israel's response to bomb Damascus. Now, why did Israel bomb Damascus at this point? Because the resistance factions in the northeast, which include Syrian Arab Army, but also tribal resistance, kind of guerrilla warfare, combined with Iranian and Iraqi militia, have been carrying out both drone attacks and missile attacks, rocket attacks against US bases in the northeast, sending a very clear message that, of course, the US illegal occupation of Syria and its resources should end. And so what we've seen, while Biden is sort of portraying himself as a rational non-war hawk, of course, what's he actually doing? He's instructing Israel to carry out the attacks on the US behalf. And this particular attack came after a series of attacks against US bases. And Israel targeted a civilian area quite close to here, about 15 minutes from here. I think at least 3 civilians were killed in that attack at night. They also targeted Damascus Citadel and a UNESCO heritage site south of Damascus near Sweda city.
And so this targeting doesn't seem to have any particular military objective. Like, these guys can pinpoint and can key target things down to the square inch. And so when they hit targets like that, it's not by, to my mind, it's not by accident with the technology that they have. There seems to be a turn. You said that some of the resistance movements, and when we say resistance movements, I think, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think what we mean is resistance to this interference by Israel and by the United States and elements like that. That these resistant movements seem to be coming together a bit more, especially since the earthquake. The attack on the 4 US bases in the oil area of the northeast of Syria seems to have come as a major shock to the US. And when they tried to retaliate for that, the Syrian Arab Army, with some other groups, retaliated for what appears to be a 24-hour period back. And I think that hasn't really been seen, at least in a few years, where the Syrian Arab Army directly asserted themselves with the US military. I could be wrong, but is that a first in quite a while?
No, I mean, there has been a sort of a kind of trickle resistance against the US occupation. Of course, it's relatively difficult because they're not only up against, well, the claim is 900 US personnel, but I would actually say it's closer to 2,000. But in that area alone, you have more than 15,000 ISIS fighters and their families basically being held in UK-funded holding camps, guarded, allegedly, by the Kurdish Contras, who actually benefit from the relationship with ISIS through corruption, through intermarriage. Many of the ISIS brides are being taken by SDF fighters. And the US itself, as I discovered quite recently after some Iranian friends of mine had actually got into the Northeast and managed to make a documentary on the US occupation, The US military themselves are carrying out killings of civilians, kidnappings of civilians. And actually, it has been reported quite recently that the US is now in the process of forming brigades of around 300 ISIS fighters, and these brigades are being dispatched to carry out attacks against Syrian Arab Army and Russian and allied positions. Now, post-earthquake, there were at least, I think, 2, if not 3, ISIS attacks against civilians east of Homs, so in the area, in the kind of mid-area of the country. And you also have to remember that the US is not only in the northeast. One of its biggest military bases at Al Tanf is in the southeast, on the kind of junction between Iraq and Jordan and Syria. And below that, you have the so-called Rukban refugee camp, which is also a recruitment area for armed groups, including ISIS and Al-Qaeda and various other splinter groups. And around Al Tanf base, you have a 55-kilometer exclusion zone established by the US, in which they are training armed groups, including ISIS, in the use of artillery weaponry such as HIMARS, which has a range of about 250 kilometers. So from there, they could effectively target Damascus. Israel regularly uses Al Tanf as a launch base, so that's another factor which demonstrates the collaboration between the US and Israel in carrying out unlawful aggression against a sovereign nation, which is Syria. The claim, of course, is always that Israel is preemptively defending itself against Iranian militia inside Syria. Now, the truth is that actually Iran has withdrawn the majority of its military forces. It does have military advisors inside Syria, and it is, of course, an ally of Syria. So for Syria as a sovereign nation, it has the right, particularly in a situation where it's defending itself against, a NATO member state invasion of its territory. And for Israel to declare that it's in self-defense that it's carrying out these attacks is ridiculous. It actually killed 2 Iranian military advisors in about 2 or 3 attacks ago. One was killed instantly and the other died from his wounds. And of course, the other agenda that Israel is following is to try to preemptively destroy Syria's capability of defending themselves by targeting the air defense systems, but not only the systems. In every attack, at least 1 or 2 Syrian air defense personnel are killed. And I was discussing this with Kevork Almasyan yesterday, and as he pointed out, it takes years to train these guys in the use of the air defense systems, particularly because now they're receiving air defense systems from Russia and air defense systems from Iran. So you have 2 sort of differing technologies that these guys now have to be trained in and be brought up to speed in using, because what they are currently using are the old Panzer air defense, which is a relatively old technology, but they know it. And to be fair, it's pretty successful. I would say at least 80–90% of the Israeli missiles are brought down in every attack. But again, when Israel, generally where I live, the missiles tend to pass overhead. So, we're among the first to know that there's an attack going on. And just for people to understand, the sound of a winged missile is very similar to a jet passing overhead. It's incredibly loud. But when the air defense bring down these missiles, of course, then you've got the danger of shrapnel landing in civilian residential areas. And at the same time, Israel has been targeting Aleppo International Airport, which of course is the humanitarian lifeline for those most affected by the earthquake in February. but also Damascus International Airport, both of which are predominantly civilian aviation. And what else does Israel do? A lot of people will not be aware of this. I've written about it. But what Israel often does is actually to use civilian aircraft as cover for these attacks. So, for example, the last attack, I think there was a Syrian airline civil aviation flight taking off to UAE, which managed to dodge the incoming missiles. And there was an incoming flight, I think, from Iran, from memory. But this is a regular occurrence. So what does it do? Of course, it prevents the Syrian air defense being used because they don't want to bring down a passenger jet.
So it's using human shields, essentially.
Basically, yeah.
In the air. It's a very complex situation. So many parties involved in it. I don't think the Syrian people asked for this. I don't think the Syrian current government asked for this in any way. Although we know that Israel are party to this, and everybody confirms it, although we know that the UN Secretary General does not seem to know that the United States have troops on the ground in Syria. We're going to have a look at a video of an interview that was done, or a question that was thrown at the UN Secretary General spokesperson, who is the mouthpiece of the UN Secretary General. And when he's asked about US troops, is it ignorance or is it deception? Have a watch of this and come back to us.
Do you think the presence of the U.S. military in Syria is illegal or not?
That's not an issue that we're dealing with at this stage. There's been a war.
But is that because it sounds very familiar. This week we talk a lot about the UN Charter, the international law, and relative resolutions. But it sounds to me a foreign military-based presence in another country without invitation sounds like something else to me. You know.
I'll leave your analysis to you. There's at this stage.
What's the difference between Syria, the situation in Syria, and the situation in Ukraine?
There's no U.S. armed forces inside of Syria, and so I don't have a. It's not a parallel situation.
You're sure there's no U.S. military personnel?
I believe there's military activity.
Yeah.
But in terms of a ground presence in Syria, I'm not aware of that.
Okay, 5 U.S. service members were injured in that attack. If there were no U.S. service members in Syria, how could they got injured? That's weird, right? Should I ask you about that?
That was the UN Secretary General spokesperson, Farhan Haq, who, is he deluded? Is he deceiving us? What do you think is going on there, Vanessa?
I mean, this was just extraordinary, and kudos to the Chinese journalist that was really pushing him on this. I mean, he didn't let him off the hook. I mean, this, even the US has admitted that they have military presence in Syria. Everyone knows that the US has military presence in Syria. I mean, this was just extraordinary. Look, we know that the UN is pretty much a vassal institution of the US. We do know that, and we've seen that over the last 12 years in Syria. But this was just, I don't think you can call it incompetence. I mean, there is no way.
It was almost cute. It was almost like when someone brings an animal mascot onto a TV program and they poop live on TV. I don't know whether it's not a case maybe that he was ignorant. He was ignorant of the fact that we all know. Maybe that was the problem. He stormed back in afterwards and he says, "Who told them, guys? Who told them?" So it's just it's shocking. It's astounding that somebody at such a high level doesn't have the basics, and it shows that to my mind this element of personalized careerism, that they don't give a damn. They're just there for their position and they're at an individual personal level. They don't give a damn. Because I just want to go back to the Syrian people for a minute, Vanessa. We had that earthquake a month and a half, 2 months ago now, is it? And since then, there's been no more word. But Syria was cut out. I remember there was the night after the earthquake, there was a map put online of the air activity over Turkey and Syria, and there was nothing. over Syria, and Turkey was very, very active. And the Syrian people, you walk down the street every day, you go to the shop, you talk to people, you know people. How are the people?
They're exhausted. And, you know, really the earthquake was kind of the final straw, I think. You know, people, I'm not saying that people were recovering, but there was an element of stagnation where at least they could start rebuilding and rehabilitating themselves to some extent, since really the major part of the military campaign ended in 2018. But this was, one, it was so unexpected, and two, particularly in Aleppo, and Aleppo was one of the cities that was targeted by the terrorist groups, particularly those under the control of Turkey. Turkey very much saw Aleppo as, you know, a future gain for Erdogan and Turkey, that they would be able to annex this territory, have it under the control of the armed groups that they authorize and control. And then once those areas infested by the terrorist groups were liberated from 2016 to 2018, and probably a bit longer actually, probably into 2019, 2020, in the western areas and the northern areas, people had started to come back, and people had started to rebuild. And when I went to Aleppo a few days after the earthquake, what was just devastating for me, I'd seen the gradual cleaning up process after the war, and all of the streets had been swept clean of rubble. The Umayyad Mosque was being rebuilt. The citadel had been renovated and was open again to tourists. The old city, they'd cleared all the rubble from the streets, and the houses had started to be rebuilt and renovated. The souk had been renovated. You know, everything was kind of coming back to life. And when I went there and I walked through these same streets, I was devastated, because it was like we'd just gone back 3-4 years. And the worst thing was, in one of the hardest hit areas, we were speaking to a guy whose house had, you know, been completely destroyed by the earthquake. He wasn't there, thankfully, when it happened, but he came a few days after. And he said the worst thing was, when it happened, people ran out of their houses to escape the earthquake, but in the very narrow streets, what was happening, the houses were collapsing on top of them. So actually, it was the worst possible thing they could have done. And as you said, you know, the response, the international response was zero for central Syria, Syria real, that is under the protection of the Syrian government. There was millions in funding and in humanitarian aid being flooded into the northwest, which is under the control of Al-Qaeda. And of course, they exploited the tragedy to rejuvenate the discredited White Helmet organization established by the CIA and MI6 to embed with the armed groups and provide them with sort of humanitarian pretext, and also to corroborate UK foreign policy, particularly in Syria, and to provide the spurious evidence of the alleged chemical attacks that have now been you know, widely disproven, including the Duma attack in 2018 that has been disproven by the OPCW inspectors themselves. And so, you know, I think what was so difficult to comprehend, and I think this demonstrated the absolute hypocrisy of the claims of humanitarianism from the West, because when you can completely ignore the majority of the Syrian people that were affected by the earthquake and simply be sending aid and relief to Al-Qaeda, then it becomes blatantly obvious. The US made some kind of gesture of saying they would lift the sanctions for 6 months for the earthquake, but they will not collaborate with the Syrian government. So in other words, they're not going to do anything. We still can't transfer money to Syria. By the way, we still can't dock ships in the Mediterranean coast because the US is intercepting an awful lot of them in international waters.
But what kind of people is it, Vanessa? About 6 months ago, Putin was widely reported in Western media, Vladimir Putin, of describing elements of the US government as devils. And at the time, I thought that maybe it's not the best choice of language, but I actually pondered on this a few weeks ago, and I said to myself, well, in modern contemporary, even non-religious terms, what would a devil be? And I suppose if you look at things like Lord of the Rings and all these kind of things, evil or the devil or people who want to create world war, people who want to dominate with a particular narrative and dictate and do. When you see the images of the children alive, talking under the rubble, how could you distinguish one from another based on the politics of a government or based on a borderline? How could you do that? And yet that's what they were doing and are doing.
Well, because you're talking about infanticidal maniacs. I mean, you only have to go back to Iraq, to Libya, you know, to understand that they want Syrians dead. I wrote about this after the earthquake. I said, you know, the West doesn't care about the Syrian people. Even in the Northwest, they don't care about the Syrian people. They care about financing the armed groups, empowering the armed groups to carry out new waves of attacks against Syrian Arab army positions, and that is happening right now. They care about empowering their own agenda in Syria, doubling down on their narratives, despite the fact that they've been, you know, roundly debunked, and basically exploiting the tragedy to increase their military war, or to revive their military war against Syria. As I said, there were a number of ISIS attacks which can only be carried out with the authorization of the US and the UK. Immediately after the earthquake, Israel bombed immediately after the earthquake. Armed groups in Idlib carried out attacks and then blamed President Assad for retaliating and claiming, of course, that he was hitting civilian areas. They also tried to claim that President Assad was refusing to send aid to the Northwest, which again was complete fallacy, because what was happening, Abu Muhammad Jolani, the head of Al-Qaeda or Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, was refusing the entry of the convoy. He made a public statement about it, saying that he refused to legitimize the Syrian government by allowing the convoy to enter. He did, however, ask for $10,000 per truck to enter, so he would have allowed them in were they prepared to pay him, you know, his fee. And what is the West doing? The West is talking about opening up all the border crossings. Well, what does that mean? That means sending more weapons, more financing, more equipment, more aid into the armed groups under the pretext of sending it to the White Helmets.
Yeah, never let an opportunity to make
you know, and this is it. You know, people, whether you call them devils, whether you call them psychopaths, whether you call them genocidal maniacs, you know, we are ruled by very evil people who really, they don't give a shit about their own populations. You know, we saw that during the COVID project. They certainly don't care about brown people in Syria or in Iraq or in Libya or in Palestine.
There are positives, aren't there, Vanessa, starting to emerge, little glimmers. There seems to be a warming of relationships between Syria and Turkey, Syria and Saudi Arabia, and a general moving or acknowledgement of this multi-dimensional or polar world that's starting to emerge now. There are positives there that could help in the rebuilding of Syria, that could help in the pacification of what's happening. How hopeful, well, maybe to let people have a little bit of detail about it, could you elaborate on those positive developments?
Yeah, I mean, of course, the first thing that happened was President Assad's state visit to Moscow, which was quite extraordinary. You know, I mean, he was met by Bogdanov, the deputy foreign minister. Syrian national anthem was played, etc. I mean, this was quite a serious state visit. That was followed up by another state visit into the United Arab Emirates, the UAE. during which the president's plane, was actually escorted in by UAE warplanes. Now, people need to understand how significant this visit was, because the West, of course, tried to play it down. The BBC in particular tried to play it down and said, yeah, but he visited 2 years ago. No, hold on. What the UAE was doing here was basically acting outside the influence of the US and the UK and Israel. Okay, the UAE has been allied with Israel, for example, in Yemen. It has Israeli intelligence agencies in the UAE and US and UK intelligence and mercenary outfits like Blackwater, or whatever it's now called, Academy. And the president's plane actually landed in the middle of a number of US military bases in the UAE. So this was a huge 2 fingers up to the West by the UAE and by Syria. I mean, this was, and of course he arrived with his wife. So this was really, you know, going back to pre-2011, it was a massive symbolic gesture. And of course, what happened after that? China brokered the peace deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia that nobody ever imagined would happen. Now the war in Yemen looks like it's going to end. I mean, Oman is on its way there tomorrow to talk. There's a ceasefire agreed. Saudi Arabia is having talks with the constitutionally elected Salvation government inside Yemen, not its kind of proxy government that fled the country in 2015 and demanded that Saudi Arabia bomb it. You know, there are a huge number of shifts going on here. Saudi Arabia will open its embassy in April or May. So Saudi Arabia, that was responsible for the funding of many of the terrorist groups inside Syria, is now being welcomed back.
I'd still be sleeping with one eye open.
Yeah, but you know, I think the thing is, what these countries are looking at, if you look at it realistically, they're looking at the West and they're seeing it, you know, it's becoming a bit demented. It's the US has plunged the EU into the war in Ukraine. The EU is committing suicide in Ukraine. There's the de-dollarization going on. More and more countries are saying that they're going to start trading in their own currencies. And as Mike Rubio said very recently, you know, shit, our siege warfare is not going to work anymore, because if we're placing sanctions and people aren't using the dollar, then we're screwed.
They're actually placing themselves under siege. When you siege everybody around you, you actually place yourself.
Well, no, what they've done is they've forced everybody's hands, right? And I was talking with Kevork about this. You know, they have spent decades since the First World War creating groups like the Muslim Brotherhood, weaponizing them against socialist governments, communist governments, or relations with communist governments, against pan-Arabism particularly, which is the unification of North Africa and Middle East countries. And effectively, what do we have now? We have the re-emergence of pan-Arabism and the unification of all the resistance factions. Damascus has welcomed back Hamas. Hamas was responsible for much of the destabilization in Syria. It's a Muslim Brotherhood organization, right? It works, it complies with the US-UK agenda in Syria. Many people don't understand that. But Damascus has welcomed them back, right? So what Damascus and Iran and Hezbollah and Iraqi Hashd al-Shabi factions have been doing and working at is this unification of the resistance axis. And Syria, who's always been at the center of that, right? And now with the end of the war in Yemen, of course, what Israel is terrified of, it's surrounded, it's completely cornered, because even Yemen can fire missiles, long-range missiles, into the occupied territories. Lebanon, Hezbollah is an army beyond their wildest imagination now.
You spoke about the need for Israel's need for war. Could you elaborate on that a bit?
Well, yeah, I mean, basically, Israel it has always used war to, let's say, maintain the unity of its population. The majority of which, of course, are settler Israelis that are occupying Palestinian land. And what's happening now is that Netanyahu has created virtually a civil war situation inside Israel itself by trying to reform the judiciary system, so that basically the prime minister has control over who is elected as judge within that system, and basically parliament has the right to overturn a judiciary decision. Now, of course, what's this for? This is to protect Netanyahu himself, who is facing corruption charges, or has been for some time. And of course, what's that done? It's ignited various protests within Israel itself. And since his rather fraudulent re-election, of course, what has he been doing? He's also been pivoting the country further right, installing far-right militia and government agencies. Yeah. And what, again, some people don't know about Netanyahu is that he is a follower of revisionist Zionism. Now, revisionist Zionism was started by Jabotinsky back in the kind of 1920s. Jabotinsky allied himself with Simon Petlura, the president of the Republic of Ukraine. Petlura was a Nazi. Petlura carried out various ethnic cleansing programs against Jews and communists. But Jabotinsky allied himself with it because basically the Zionist movement, or the revisionist Zionist movement, is maximalist as regards territory. So they believe that they should, in the Greater Israel Project. But also they believe in allying themselves with these far-right elements when it comes to defending themselves against Russia, for example, in Ukraine. And so it's not really surprising that Netanyahu now is pushing further right. His finance minister in Paris was talking about the annexation of Transjordan, of even going as far as Damascus because Greater Israel and so on. So, there are huge fissures kind of appearing in Israel itself. So, of course, what would Israel normally do is start a war in order to kind of bring everybody under the same umbrella of fighting, the common enemy. But the problem is now they have the arming, the weaponization of the internal Palestinian resistance now are weaponized, right? Weapons have been coming into the occupied territories. Weapons have been coming into Gaza. Gaza is capable of creating mayhem in Israel. Gaza, little besieged Gaza, the size of the Isle of Wight is breaking through the so-called Iron Dome. But you've got Hezbollah, you have Syria, Jordan and UAE are now up in arms about the infractions against the Palestinian people in Al-Aqsa, another major one today. Al-Aqsa was stormed by Israeli settlers today. Yemen, as I mentioned, Iraq, Hashd al-Shabi. Israel is
even
surrounded.
Internally, you had the ongoing attacks on the Orthodox Jews there, what you might call the original Jews that were there. But as well as that, I read something recently, and I haven't saved it, but it was either from a retired senior military guy in Israel, or maybe even a retired minister. But they said that they should look at warming the relationship with Syria. And so even internally, it would appear those discussions have been had in certain circles. What's the reality of that? Do you think that could ever happen?
Well, as I keep saying, Israel is probably in the most vulnerable position it's ever been in. The US isn't going to come to its aid. The US is bogged down in Ukraine and in various other arenas. It's trying desperately to reclaim Africa where it's, it's lost out to Russia and China. It's withdrawing to Mauritania, from where it's trying to build up a troop presence. Of course, it's embedding Al-Qaeda and various other terrorist groups in order to give it a pretext to be there. But Israel right now is isolated. It's already failed to send weapons to Ukraine, even though that's one of the campaign messages from Netanyahu before his election. So why aren't they sending weapons? Can they not afford to? You have to ask that question. And even the retaliation against the missile strikes in the last 2 days have been nothing more than what I call propaganda strikes. I mean, they hit last night, but it was really feeble by Israeli standards. It's almost like
thankfully.
Well, yeah, but this is indicative that the bully is starting to feel bullied, right? Because who's carrying out the attacks in Syria? The attacks from the Quneitra, which is on the border with the annexed territories of Golan by Israel, were carried out by Liwa al-Quds, which are a Palestinian regiment in the Syrian Arab Army. Again, a lot of people don't know that there are Palestinian factions actually within the Syrian army itself. And the missiles fired from South Lebanon are being claimed by Palestinian factions. So it's very clear how the resistance is running this, right? They're allowing the Palestinians to carry out these attacks from their territory. So this means if Israel attacks Syrian Arab Army positions, they're like, you don't have the right to do that. We didn't carry out the attack. But at the same time, we're giving the Palestinian resistance factions authorization in some way to carry out retaliation attacks for what you're doing internally in the occupied territories, which is absolutely correct.
Is there a danger, Vanessa? A cornered animal is the most dangerous animal. Is there a danger that Syria could go OTT with everything over the next few months as it feels more and more cornered?
I don't think so, because I think it knows the danger it faces if it does. I would be very surprised. They would have to be completely insane to do that. Because, as I said, even Jordan, after the comments by the finance minister about, effectively Israel should comprise of territory within Jordan itself, even former allies, the UAE was a former ally, are starting to kind of turn against Israel. And if Syria manages to reconcile with Turkey, which of course is entirely dependent on Erdogan withdrawing all of his troops, both Turkish military and the terrorist factions, and returning the status quo to pre-2011. But if that comes through, and Egypt also, by the way, is coming on board with Syria right now. And Egypt is vulnerable from the Sinai, which is really a Mossad operation to weaponize terrorist groups there to destabilize the Sinai, and also from Libya. Terrorists are still coming across the border into Egypt from Libya. So Egypt is vulnerable. It knows it needs to form a pact with the resistance axis. So as I said, Pan-Arabism is re-emerging at this time and is genuinely threatening Israeli security. Now, if Israel, I mean, the messages from all of the resistance countries have been very clear. If you attack one finger on the hand, the whole hand will respond. And those are not empty words. I mean, Hamas leaders were in Lebanon today speaking to Nasrallah. The leader of Ansarullah in Yemen has put out a statement saying, we don't accept what you're doing in Palestine. And with peace on the horizon in Yemen, then Yemen can turn its focus to the war on behalf of Palestine.
But they've got the likes of Ben Gvir in that in government. He appears he's going to be there for another 4 years anyway, unless there's some kind of a revolution in Israel, which is not beyond
not impossible
at this stage. We're getting short on time now, Vanessa. A couple of very brief questions. if I was to ask you, what space should people watch over the next month in terms of Syria? Is there any events that are coming up? Is there anything that you think people should keep a particular close eye on?
I think really, well, there's three. The situation with Israel, the situation in the Northeast with the United States, they're going to have to withdraw at some point. The situation with Turkey, because Turkey, of course, is a NATO member state. Is Erdogan going to pivot east or west? You know, that's incredibly important. And I guess what exactly are the armed groups in the Northwest going to do? They are carrying out attacks, increased attacks against Syrian Arab army positions, but they're getting repelled. So I think those are the four corners to keep an eye on, in a sense. And, you know, even campaigning to lift the sanctions is not enough. People really need to be talking about ending the US occupation in Syria that has been ongoing since 2014.
As much as we can admire the spirit of the government, the Syrian government, and members of the Syrian Arab Army, my heart goes out to the Syrian people, every man, woman, and child who never asked for any of this, who just wanted to get on with a life and have had this put on their shoulders. Vanessa, you're one of the only people over there or anywhere bringing these absolute fruits out about Syria. I hope to talk to you maybe next month again, if you could give us an update next month. In the meantime, if people want to follow you directly, Vanessa, where can they find you?
Actually, mostly these days on Substack, on my Telegram channel, Twitter for the time being. I haven't been kicked off yet. YouTube, I'm still hanging on. But those are the four main ones, I guess.
But to focus on the Substack, that's where you get your core stuff that nobody's going to interfere with in any way.
Yeah, hopefully.
Vanessa Beeley, you stay safe over the next month or so. We'll be talking to you soon. Again, thanks for joining us. And I hope your electricity gets sorted out to get a bit more than you had today.